Okay, perhaps let me start. Thank you very much. You are now on the pedagogy of the catastrophe. This is a webinar that is part of the post-COVID-19 Urban Future series run by the Bartlett Development Planning Unit at University College London. There are many more events. I'll mention some of the next events at the end of this session. You can follow more on our websites. You find the information here on the slide. This is a series made of webinars and blogs, and you can find a lot more information also on our social media. You can find there. The webinar will work with the presentation for about the first 40 minutes, more or less, and then there will be a question and answer session. Please post your questions in the Q&A section that you should find as a Zoom option, and please include your name and affiliation. Today, what we would like to try is then to select some question and ask you individually to then join the panel and ask the question in person through the audio and possibly even through the video. If you prefer not to, you can tell to our facilitators and they will read your questions. However, this is something new that we are trying to give this possibility to attendees to join the panel to ask their questions. So we are going to experiment a little bit with the technicalities. Should this not work, then we'll resume to the style we used in previous webinars of reading the question that have been coming from the audience. Also, there is a chat option where you can share broader comments or links that you think are relevant with other webinar participants. Okay, so today in this talk, I will start with an introduction, talk a little bit more about the pedagogy of disaster, of catastrophe, which is the same thing, and also discuss a little bit what it takes to prepare a post-COVID transformation, arguing that leaderships are an important missing links. And then I'll try to present some fragments of emerging narratives that are important to build a post-COVID-19 future. And in the end, some of the characteristics as well of these new narratives that are so important to be built. And here I will touch upon as well on the intergenerational justice issue. Originally, when I prepared the title, I thought to give more space to this issue, but then there was too much into the talk. So I decided to that the center of the talk will be on the pedagogy of the disaster or catastrophe. COVID-19 will radically change the world. And the direction of this radical change will depend on how we collectively learn from the catastrophe to set the basis for a different society. In this talk, I refer to catastrophe or disasters that are a result of the Anthropocene, that is a result of biosphere dynamics that have been altered by human activity. And the key question underpinning the talk is about how can we learn from responses to COVID-19 that might allow us to be better equipped to address critical sustainability challenges. And part of the argument is that COVID-19 is a result of the ecological crisis and that there are some parallels between COVID-19 and the climate emergency. Both are largely a result of human activity, and I will discuss that later. Both require sacrifice now to reduce future suffering, of course, with different time scales, and both require global collective action. In 1966, the economist Kenneth Bolton was saying that anyone who believes that exponential growth can go on forever in a finite world is either a madman or an economist. For over 50 years, we have been knowing that exponential growth in the consumption of Earth is not sustainable, and that for a long time, we have gone beyond the biosphere's self-regenerating capacity. we are aware that the current development model is progressively destroying our capacity to live on this planet in a non-deteriorating condition. For example, 20 years ago, the World Wildlife, a mainstream and quite conservative organization, was giving this following message. If every human being on Earth today began consuming and polluting at the rate of the average North American or Western European, at least 2 more planets would be needed to provide the necessary resources. In short, we have been knowing for 50 years that we are on a train increasing its speed as it approaches a wall, unable to change direction. Collectively, we haven't done much. And some think that the colonization of the mind from the current discourse of economic growth is so powerful that blinds us from realizing simple facts, and only a shock like a catastrophe would enable change. There is always an element of denial, especially when the solution to a threat involves affecting the lifestyles and the wallets of those with power. A major shock forces a change, but the direction of that change can be shaped. And I will look at how collective pedagogy, through respected and recognized leaderships, are able to build new collective narratives, and that these narratives are fundamental in shaping the direction of the future. But first, let's go a step back. Why no action in front of ecological collapse? And it is interesting how Jared Diamond, in his book Collapse, look at 4 different failures that leads to collapse, to system collapse in the face of a threat. The first one is not being able to see the threat. The second one is, okay, we can see it, but we are in denial of it, because acknowledging it would be very difficult. The third one is we are able to see the threat, we are able to avoid the denial, but we are unable to act. And finally, we are able to see it, avoid denial, we can act, but we act ineffectively. And for a long time, there have been conversation amongst astonished ecological economists, physicists, philosophers, sociologists, activists, on how come we don't get it, and thus the inevitability of the pedagogy of the catastrophe, hoping that the first ecological disasters will be able to change our collective action before it's too late. The ecologist de Rougemont in 1977 was writing, if they are big enough to wake up the world, but not enough to smash everything, I'd call them learning experiences, the only ones able to overcome our inertia. And in the following year, François Partan wrote a book, May the Crisis Deepen, arguing that only deep crisis would prevent the self-destruction of humanity. And more recently, 2 important intellectuals, Serge Latouche in France and Enrico Euli in Italy, have explored disaster pedagogy. For Serge Latouche, a decolonizing of imaginary is needed to change a fatal path. But this can't come through a smooth change. In recent years, he was arguing and saying, in any case, the smooth transition, I no longer believe in it. Only a shock can allow us to recover. I believe very much in disaster pedagogy. In these conditions, the shift can be very fast. History is not linear. And actually, there are 2 ways in which disaster pedagogy works. One is that there is not the need for a taste of the disaster, but the hope there is that the fear of the disaster will prevent it from happening. But this actually hasn't quite happened. And the second way it works is that the idea is that the feeling and experiencing of the disasters that produce change. However, Naomi Klein argues that neoliberal capitalism needs disasters. And for example, she analyzed the response to Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, arguing how it has further impoverished the most marginalized and actually produced further profit extractions for the top elite. Therefore, it is not automatic that disaster leads to positive changes, But disaster pedagogy can help us towards a more positive change if we are able to act more powerful than lobbyist group and more powerful and more powerfully than those seeking to restore their position of power. And this is difficult because in a disaster, because powerful people are less affected than vulnerable ones, they are in a better situation to influence decision. So again, not an easy struggle. However, a key criticism of the pedagogy of disaster and catastrophe is often told through a metaphor. And the metaphor is the one of an old uncle. So you have an old uncle who is a heavy smoker. He has been diagnosed with cancer, but he continues smoking until he dies. And this is a bit of that kind of vision that you see in people that think about let's enjoy until it lasts. Is an answer of people living as much as possible a lifestyle of long flights for weekend skiing or enjoying the sun during the winter by flying away, and all this kind of rhetoric, well, let's get the best until it lasts. But actually, in reality, and this is actually a true story, my uncle, after doctors told him that unless he quit smoking, he would die soon, he quitted smoking suddenly after 60 years as a smoker. So perhaps there is something about that experiencing there. And the aspect, and what is interesting about the COVID-19 crisis is that we are learning by experiencing. We are not studying it, we are living it. We are all living it, albeit experiencing it very differently. And here it's very interesting what Peter Piot is the director of the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Disease. He discovered Ebola, and for 40 years he worked on viruses. He's probably one of the most important virologists in the world. And recently he recovered from COVID and said the following: "Now that I have felt the compelling presence of a virus in my body myself, I look at viruses differently. I realize this one will change my life, despite the confrontational experiences I have had with viruses before. I feel more vulnerable." So while the marginalized of the world have faced disaster or difficult situations for decades, it is the first time that privileged intellectuals, scientists, policymakers experience the anxiety of the lockdown. And the shock can create a cognitive instability that is the basis for a paradigm breakdown. A shock allows to overcome the denial which is used to deal with the state of cognitive dissonance that precedes a change. A state of cognitive dissonance is when we hold two or more contradictory beliefs, and when this contradiction becomes unbearable, people may change what they do, a part of what they do, to try to rebuild a coherence, a consistency. And I've been working a lot on atypical steps. So for example, animal lovers are happy to torture, kill, and eat for their own pleasure some animals with even higher sentience, intelligence, and sensitivities than other animals they are loving, protecting, and sometimes treating as family members. So in supporting people in their transition towards a choice consistent with their values and knowledge, in some cases I noticed, and this is also confirmed by study, the importance of a shocking moment, a tipping point that makes it impossible to continue with the denial of the contradiction. And another strategy is the strategy of the emergency. And this has been used by climate change movements very recently. For example, Extinction Rebellion, that is a mass non-violent global movement to ask for action on climate change. Their first condition in order to stop their action blocking the city centers of important cities was that governments declare a climate emergency. And this is quite important, Margaret Klein Salomon, who works with the climate mobilization, explained why that's so important. We have been trying for years to get people out of normal mode and into emergency mode. What is possible politically is fundamentally different when lots of people get into emergency mode, when they fundamentally accept that there's danger and that if we want to be safe, we need to do everything we can. And it's been interesting to see that theory validated by the response to the coronavirus. But so how can we make the consequences of climate crisis seem as concrete as those of COVID-19? So that's a key question. The other important point is that moments of change are the perfect moment to reimagine society. For example, a study of the Royal Society of Arts, which is a quite prestigious think tank in the UK, found that only 9% of people wanted a total return to normal after the lockdown. And yesterday, The Guardian reported that in the UK, more than 80% of people want health and well-being prioritized over economic growth. Crisis provides a chance to reevaluate and reimagine our collective futures. There are opportunities for reimagining society, but such opportunities for reimagining societies are very, very rare. And it's very effective to target moments of change, like changing job or house, where our patterns of behaviors are disrupted and we cannot simply rely on habit. In these times, individuals are required to make new choices and subsequently may establish new patterns of consumption. So intervening strategically at these moments can help steer people into a lower carbon consumption pattern. This is an opportunity where old ways of living are no longer relevant, but new ways have yet to emerge to replace them. And here Stuart Hall said, every crisis is also a moment of reconstruction. What Gramsci called interregnum. This is a period between the dying of an old social order and the birthing of a new one. But to have the paradigm change, the transition, we need thought leadership. We have the ability to communicate these collectively and bring this forward. Society is built of invisible webs of meanings, beliefs, discourses that informs what to value and where to go. And some of these are so interiorized that we don't see them as an output of collective social construction. We think this is how things are and how things have to be. The shared meanings and discourses keep society together, but they make it very difficult to change when they become inadequate. For example, the belief in economic growth when this threatens life on Earth. And these meanings and beliefs can be challenged when taken for granted realities like now are suddenly changed. But then new meanings, beliefs, and discourses needs to be shaped into a new narrative. And so now we have this predisposition to change in times of crisis, but then leaderships are fundamental, not just political leadership, but broader. But where are these leadership coming from? A first lesson we are getting from the current situation is that bad leadership in time of crisis kills. It's early to fully assess, but it's kind of clear that the action of Trump, Johnson, Bolsonaro have led to a level of excess deaths during the last few weeks that this amounts to no less than mass manslaughter. But at the same time, in these demands for leadership, there is a very important element of gender. The type of leadership needed to transition us to a more positive post-COVID-19 future is a leadership that in practice so far has been demonstrated more by women. It's quite interesting to see how Forbes, which is typical magazine of alpha male made of the richest white men, they are praising women leaders and their response, arguing that what countries with the best COVID-19 responses have in common is women leaders. And they've suggested this to a lot of front page titles of articles quite important, like the one I'm showing on the screen at the moment. At the same time, women are disproportionately affected by the response to the COVID crisis. Men die more from COVID, but women face more frontline work in the health and care sectors. Domestic violence is on the rise globally. Women disproportionately bear the weight of childcare, domestic work, and care of elderly relatives. And actually this inequality, this gender inequality, spread across social classes. So men's academic journal submissions increased during the lockdown, while women's dropped drastically. And this is a very concerned statistics. So it is clear that women should have a leading role in the process of planning an equitable society that will support the needs for all. Another mechanism that I think it's quite important, and we have seen already in terms of the response to climate change, is that the failure of leadership at national level have provided energy for mayors to take a central stage. Here, the mayor of San Francisco, London Breed, the first Black woman to ever hold that office, took action on COVID days before the governor of California. Or we have down the mayor of Freetown, Yvonne Atkins Sawyer, who met communities to develop COVID-19 plans before having cases in the country and in the city, and now has been working with other African leaders for a strategy for Africa based on working with communities and the balanced approach that takes into consideration the informal sector, informal transport, and informal settlements. Also, this leadership that can come from city needs to bring in a very disruptive and creative approach. And an example of this is an example that has almost 20 years, but is what the mayor Antanas Mockus did in Bogota. He created transform a citizen culture. He created a tax culture and pedagogy, asking people to pay 10% more in property taxes to further cross-subsidize and improve public services. And actually 62,000 households decide to voluntarily pay more taxes for that. And now in this COVID time, we have seen how mayors came together to build the Global Mayors COVID-19 Recovery Task Force to rebuild our cities and economies in a way that improves public health, reduces inequality, and addresses the climate crisis. They recognize that it is clear that the harm caused by COVID-19 has not been equitable, and that our ambition should not be a return to normal. Our goal is to build a better, more sustainable, more resilient, and fairer society out of this recovery from the COVID-19 crisis. So for me, that was incredibly inspiring. So now, despite these efforts, I don't think we already have the leaderships that can lead us into this transition to a better, different future. I think they are yet to emerge, but also the new consistent narratives that this new leadership will have to own and spread are not yet fully formed. But we have some pieces, I think, and some of these pieces are still more about the awareness of how broken the current system is than actually painting an alternative. But I've been trying to collect some ideas from different sources of some of these fragments that can inform a future narrative. Again, this is not a comprehensive list. There are many more that have been highlighted by other people, some that have existed for a long time. There are discussions around basic income, around lots of other conversations. These are just some that I found particularly interesting and where there is a lot of consensus developing, and some are not necessarily anything new or original. The first is around humans made the pandemic. And this is about the co-chairs of the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. And this comes from a quite authoritative and at the same time official source. And they write that there is a single species that is responsible for the COVID-19 pandemic, us. As with the climate and biodiversity crisis, recent pandemics are a direct consequence of human activity, particularly our global financial and economic systems based on a limited paradigm that prizes economic growth at any cost. with more than 70% of all emerging diseases affecting people having originating in wildlife and domestic animals. Rampant deforestation, uncontrolled expansion of agriculture, intensive farming, mining, and infrastructure development, as well as the exploitation of wild species, have created the perfect storm for the spillover of diseases from wildlife to people. And actually, it's also interesting, some organization I mentioned before, the World Wildlife Funds, again, a quite conservative and mainstream organization in many arguments, they now came out with this powerful statement arguing that this is not the first zoonotic disease, a disease that comes from animal, and the causative factors are land use change, agriculture and livestock intensification, and wildlife exploration. And as compounding factors, we have climate change and global trade and travels. So again, there is an agreement from the most mainstream organization to intergovernmental one about our role in this. Then there is another, and I'm going quite quick on these points, but that the primary aim of business is not profit. This is a change, a paradigm change in the business environment. This was pre-COVID, and we had core messages at Davos and before, with top CEOs saying profit is not the primary business, but the primary aim of business, but purpose, and linking these often to sustainable development goals, to climate change missions, and other actual social and environmental issues. And I think this is a paradigm change where the private sector has entered this kind of conversation. We have learned that there is, in fact, a money tree with trillions produced by central banks and government that can do massive intervention in the economy. We have learned that the state is powerful and takes swift action on massive scale. And this, of course, offers opportunity for the economy to be changed towards what citizens ask, but only if the accountability link between people and government is there, and if people collectively express the need for and the direction of change. We also learned that policy must have the backing of scientists. And for example, Peter Piot, that I mentioned before, who discovered Ebola, is now the advisor to the president of the European Commission on this. And actually, for example, Angela Merkel in 2007, she was saying, you can be assured that I won't accept trusted scientific findings, such as those by the IPCC on climate change to be watered down. And I think it's not a coincidence that Germany's science-based answer to COVID-19, led by a scientist chancellor, have been one of the most effective. And of course, you can handpick scientists, you can co-opt them to support your decision, but even Boris Johnson has to use the rhetoric that whatever they do is led by science. And I think this is very, very different. And I think problematic to some extent. We then need to recognize that science is political, and that's the other important steps linked to that. The other point is that states need to pool resources to deliver global public goods. We can't leave it to the market. I think we are learning that. And COVID is a global issue that needs to be addressed through global collective action. But this comes at the end time of the liberal order, where multilateralism is collapsing, is at the lowest point in the last 30 years under the forces of national populism. But we are realizing its importance nevertheless. And I think a very interesting point here was Tedros heading the World Health Organization, saying that the ultimate measure of success, referring to the vaccine, to the vaccination in terms of a COVID-19, will not be how fast we can develop tools, it will be how equally we can distribute them. And so this idea of a global governance, of thinking about collective action. The other important aspect is the nudging, the leveraging on the power of the state in bailing out the economy, of actually put conditionality. Yes, we are going to save you, but you need to go green. Yes, we're going to save you, but you need to implement workers' rights. And so we can really reshape the economy of the future, leverage on this power of the state if we can push it. We also learned that delaying action can be costly, and also that fast radical action is possible. We were before being told so many times there is no alternative. Actually, that's no longer tenable. There must be an alternative because things are changing so fast. But of course, the direction of the change can go both ways. There is also a lot of anti-European and populist forces that have seen how suddenly things can go and are ready to destroy Europe and democracy. So again, we need, it's an important point. I think fast radical change is possible, but again, how do we make sure it goes in the right direction? People can change their behaviors. We were saying, lifestyle couldn't be touched, but actually can. And we've learned the precarity of our lifestyles. We've learned we can't go back to normal. And again, because the normal was the problem, this is probably the biggest mainstreamed slogan that you will hear. And finally, a point that I think it's quite interesting on how the personal action is not separate from politics. The personal is part of the political. This is fundamental. The environmental movement has lived a contradiction, with environment justice professionals, including academics, being amongst those with the highest level of consumption of earth and emission, not changing their behavior, insane quantity of flying, academic flying, and eating animal products, arguing that individual behavior isn't important because only structural measure can address the issues of climate change. And I think what the COVID crisis is teaching us is that personal action is fundamental, both physical distancing and caring for neighbors. So the importance of being citizens against consumer for society. So we both need the personal actions together with the more structural, global, coordinated actions. And then, of course, I think there will be a great change in the attitude towards travels, both business and leisure. And we have seen that organizations would prepare for remote working against climate change as an advantage for COVID-19. And actually we're better able to deal with it. And I don't think there will be a going back in a lot of these remote distance working. And we have learned that a lot of care and health work is very important. And actually there is a lot of low carbon jobs in these sectors that are good for the well-being of all of us and also good for the environment. And finally, that we need a new social contract for the digital age. We have found the French government asking Google and Facebook to overlook privacy in order to enable big data tracing. But can we think how this technology can be democratized, not just using communities instrumentally to penetrate territory, but to enable communities to control some of the technology and use it for other purposes of community building, of welfare, etc. There has been already a change in the social contract. People are giving the state more power, the power of limiting rights in exchange for protection of life, income, etc. But this cannot be enough. Giving up privacy and data can only be done with a different social contract of further democratization and check and balances on these powers, even during emergencies. And I think empowerment and community building should be central to the digital social contract. States are using the pandemic to acquire new powers indefinitely, and it is scary. We need a democratic and inclusive digital revolution. If it excludes people, then the digital tools to control the pandemic would not work. But digital tools can also provide more effective ways of delivering welfare. Just let's think about Canada or New Zealand, where government have made COVID-19 payments to unemployed people within 2 hours from the request. This can be scaled up to a lot of other countries. And now, finally, coming to a conclusion, what are some of the characteristics of these new narratives for a post-COVID future that we can build together? And the first steps is a consideration around intergenerational justice. COVID-19 responses has demonstrated a collective sacrifice to protect the most vulnerable, including and especially the elderly. Government failed them. Thousands died in the care homes where the neoliberal capitalist society and the neoliberal capitalist family decided to dump them. In the UK, 84% of care beds are private, mostly owned by private equity that has short-term profit as objective. But in people's response, there has been a sense of care for others. And particularly countries like Italy and Spain, there has never been the question between protecting the economy and protecting the elderly. the elderly have been, and other vulnerable people have been given priority. And actually children that are almost unaffected by COVID in terms of getting the disease have been given up school, their friends. In Italy and Spain, they haven't left their homes for 2 months. That was a massive sacrifice from children. So now perhaps it's the time of a narrative of protecting the children and future generations. And we can make that narrative emerge. The other big characteristics of this new narrative is that in few weeks, the public support for the limitation of individual freedoms and rights in order to protect other rights give us a clear sense that rights are not absolute. And those countries and those states that felt this mandate to limit some rights to protect others immediately were those that were able to promptly act. And actually this is interesting because immediately after 9/11, George W. Bush claimed that we won't change our way of life, but it is exactly that way of life that had to be changed. And finally, in 2009 in Copenhagen, Angela Merkel changed this global narrative. She said, we all need to help each other, and we all have to be willing to change the way we live. And I think that was a big turning point. This means that even the right to consume may be limited to protect other rights. However, it needs democratic decisions on hierarchies between conflicting rights. To conclude, we need to reconstruct a pedagogical narrative, and I think a populist one in its original meaning, to counter national populism. The narrative shouldn't be too difficult, too complex. Should be one that invokes the unity of Earth residents against a shared external threat, pathogens, climate change, ecological collapse, in a sort of an epic narrative of unity, not too dissimilar to one like Star Trek, but that shifts human centrality to a collective, and the collective that embeds other living beings of our Earth, including animals. So the Earth united fighting for a sustainable future, or given the situation, even just for a future. Sorry. Bolsonaro and Trump have been really good at creating powerful narratives on threatened identities, particularly around the patriarchal white man. They've been able to racialize the virus as the Chinese virus. Can we challenge them? Because the risk is really that we enter a dystopia. So far, recent pandemics such as Ebola have not reduced inequalities afterwards. And if we look even older pandemic, they have created some very dystopian situation. Let's take the yellow fever in New Orleans in the 19th centuries. That created stratified society with even worse inequality. Slaves who survived yellow fever and became immune were worth double to their owners. And workers who didn't have it were unable to find jobs. So how can we manage, for example, something like immunity passports, supposedly that they work, in a way that do not add another layer of inequality? And in this pandemic, we are already seeing how ethnic minorities are worse affected. In Chicago, more than 70% of pandemic deaths have been of African America, who are only a third of the resident population. Historical evidence from early pandemics shows that in the early stage, when the diseases are new or poorly understood, the rich and powerful are not exempt. But over time, they find a way of coping, which is not something that the poor do. But Amartya Sen actually gives us a more positive tale. He's arguing that of diminishing undernourishment and increased life expectancy in Britain during the Second World War, and praising the response of Britain during the Second World War. Let's try and see what happened and learn from that. So he's saying, and I quote from Amartya Sen, facing a big reduction of total food availability, Britain arranged more equal food sharing through rationing and social support. The chronically undernourished were much better fed than ever before. A similar thing happened with better shared medical attention. And I end the quote. So China was trying to demonstrate that authoritarian government is better at protecting life in the current global context. In the United States, as in Europe, the pandemic will further accelerate the ripening of conditions for a strongman role. How can the new narrative save democracy? Can we build a new narrative that brings us beyond the neoliberalism understood as a phase of capitalism? And the final point, the final 2 points is really, now there is a narrative around Africa's self-representations. A lot of scholars are thinking about this pandemic as an opportunity to break down the interiorized discourse of the superiority of the colonial masters. In many ways, the pandemic is an opportunity for African peoples to see themselves differently, they argue, and for the world to consider the African continent as a partner in finding solutions to complex problems such as COVID-19. So again, a new narrative built on a post-colonial understanding and a different, more equal global relations. And the final point to conclude is that the new narrative should also disrupt the centrality of humans and rethink our relationship with animals. As COVID-19 and hundreds of other zoonotic diseases have demonstrated, humanity's oppressive relationship with other animals is not only dangerous for non-humans, but it is dangerous for humans, and particularly for the vulnerable. Perhaps the COVID-19 crisis will make us realize that human societies are deeply and consistently shaped by our relationships with other animals. The pandemic has disrupted all that humans hold dear, from major social institutions to the most minor of social interaction. And as such, we cannot afford to continue ignoring and devaluing the non-human factor in human social life. At the policy level, this task is huge, but as the global response to COVID-19 has indicated, big change can happen very fast when the impetus is there. Thank you very much. And you are very welcome to post your questions in the question and answer sections, and Valeria will deal with those. Maybe I can start. I'm seeing a lot of questions down there, so maybe let me start addressing some. So I think while we are getting some panelists into the conversations, I think there is an interesting one around the points of democratizing democracy. And I think, again, an important point there is that unless we are giving more power to states in these processes, and both digitally and in terms of limiting our rights. So if we don't want the kind of arguments that we are getting from a number of countries who are saying actually a more authoritarian government is more effective and work better in this situation, the only our response is to make democracy works better and responds better to citizens. And this is particularly when more and more rights are given up. And so this is that requires a sort of different social contracts and a sort of different system. If we take, for example, the bad example of the UK, where we are a liberal democracy, but there has been very little chance to keep the government to account in the disastrous way in which this has been managed, I think it would be very, the argument for an authoritarian government or an authoritarian person, as we are hearing more and more, will come in quite true if we are not able to demonstrate that democracy can actually works better for citizens. And so I think there is a big process of democratizing it and also using it in different ways in communities. Do we have more questions? Valeria, do you want to
let me
a question?
We go to a Q&A. So one of the questions, and again, I repeat, if anyone wants to ask the question directly, that is also an option. So let me read some of the first ones that we received. So we may argue that the narratives can be improved and that this is an opportunity. However, many of the most effective channels are privately owned by groups. that may not be interested in any progressive change, how to overcome this challenge. Second question is, the Amsterdam leadership is taking the donut economic model on board. How can we equally redistribute this tool? And a couple of people are asking to repeat the point number 1. But if you can clarify the point number 1 of either the conclusions.
Let me start on this very quickly. So again, on the private sector, I think what this crisis is demonstrating is that actually government is incredibly powerful. And again, even the most powerful companies are all asking to be bailouts. Richard Branson in the UK with Virgin in an offshore tax havens has been one of the first asking to be bailouts. So again, the private sector is quite strong, but what this is teaching us is actually states still have a lot of power and a lot of power to address and creates conditionalities. And very easily we have seen there are lots of governments that are saying we're not going to provide any pound of help to companies unless if they are based in tax havens, if they are not willing to improve their track record on workers' rights, if they're not willing to bring in an ecological dimension and cut their emissions. So again, there is a strong power from the states. Nevertheless, yes, the private sector needs to be brought in. But again, I really felt that there is a change in the discourse of the private sectors that can be co-opted towards a systemic change. In the terms of the donut economics that is been arguing and conversation around an economic system that can stay within the biosphere limits, I think that that's certainly the route to go through. But to do that, we really need to still break down some of the paradigmatic ideas of the current system that I think this crisis is helping us to deconstruct. But I think, and that's certainly a way of building it, but I think it's not enough for a new narrative that can get to that can arrive to everyone. And then on the point 1, I'm really happy that I guess was around the humans caused the pandemic. I'm really happy to share the slides even in a link in the chat at the end of this, or will be posted very quickly, so you have some of that text.
Yes, now there are a series of questions that are somehow related. So one, I'm going to read the most important bit of those. So can you share a bit more about the most promising emerging narratives with potential for radical change that is connected also to another questions about the progressive welfare state type of political project, if it's only suitable for developed countries or a post-capitalist world? And another one from the chat. So conditions that need to be fulfilled so that the shock of Corona can be used to pull us in a positive direction instead of a negative one. So 3 of them talking about like radical changes ahead.
I'll start with the last one, which I think it's probably the most difficult. And I think the missing bit for me is leaderships. That's fundamental. We need really, and these are not just politically, it's public intellectual, it's thought leadership. And I'm not seeing those people able to present a different narrative. Perhaps it's also difficult in this climate of lockdown to have that sort of a collective action to develop this, to recognize each other and develop that. But I believe that such change needs some leaderships. And if you think a lot of the big positive changes or post-colonial changes or other type of changes I've always were built on some leaderships. And at the moment is there where I'm struggling in identifying that. I think, and I believe that some of these characteristics is that some they can come from different level, for example, from city level, and even some city level mayors can have a global impact. And we are seeing this with the task force that has been created. And also that this, that it's a time probably for some women to be in this position of global leadership in guiding us in these new phases. But I think that's the kind of condition that I've seen missing at the moment. And this is also linked to the most promising narratives. For me, I've been trying to map very mainstream ones. There are, of course, a lot of more radical groups that in these moments in time are really rethinking some utopias and new ways. And these are very important. But what I've tried to collect in these talks are the ones that are more mainstream. And there have been some changes that I think are incredible. There are editorials of the Financial Times saying that a universal basic income is basically a necessary tool for dealing with the COVID and post-COVID scenario. Again, these were discourses and ideas and policy proposals that were in the margins just a year ago or 2 years ago, and now they are at the forefront, and so forth with other type of things.
Now we might have to select some of the other questions. There are two questions referring to the control, over the internet. I mean, if it's possible to have true control over the internet and who's controlling all this, and also about manipulation of digital and political ideas and behavior, how this manipulation can be clearly identified and stopped as a threat in a time of such weakness and vulnerability.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not an expert, but I think we have seen that the internet can be controlled, but do we want that to be controlled as it is in certain countries? Or do we want these digital aspects to be considered a public good that needs to create institutions that are able to treat it and protect it as a public good? And I think this is quite interesting because, for example, there has been a lot of discourses around smart cities in particular, and now around Corona, of getting, for example, this app to penetrate amongst the urban poor in the global south for distancing and control and collecting a number of data. But can then we have some sort of decentralized use that is ethical of some of this data that serves the communities, so that is not just the all-powerful state that can use this data, okay, for something good around COVID, but later on maybe something not so good, and actually it's very difficult then to control that. But that's also, communities are empowered in this digital transition to actually exercise some control and power and use some of the benefits of this data and this digital transition for their own perspective. And this can be, uniting communities, creating new communications levels in communities, can also be to receive welfare in certain ways, to receive infrastructures, and all sorts of other services, basically.
We'll ask a question what is quite unique, and then I can put all the two together if there is time. So how are these emerging narratives redefine the development planning unit's notion of development? And then there are other two. So how you deepen the reflection on the necessity of a new populism, and how could it be any possible without going straight to new forms of authoritarianism? And probably the last one that we can include in there it's, how do you see solutions beyond the nation state? Yes.
Okay.
About for municipalism.
So the first one, I don't really have an answer, and I can't talk about the DPU, but I think in the DPU we have been criticizing traditional notion of developments linked to economic growth for a very long time. Is also the DPU is a very diverse body of people. there have been more critical stances and so forth for a long. So I don't want to enter a lot into that, but certainly all this language and this lexicon will have to be reframed for a post-COVID reality. In terms of populism, I think that's something that I wasn't time to develop in this talk, but again, that populist is not necessarily authoritarianist. I think in the last few years, because there has been this nationalist populism rising up, that populism has been associated to this, but there can be, and there has been a lot of discussion about more progressive populist discourse. And here I'm simply, what I'm saying is simply about creating a narrative that can help people see a different horizon, a different type of society, and potentially one that is simple enough for people to associate with it, and within this create something in common, in a desire of building a future that is sustainable, where we cooperate and that can possibly bring in a new, and this linked to the final question, a new sort of more multilateral world, but even a world that goes beyond multilateralism, the world that possibly realize that we need some sort of a global governance on some important issues. And again, COVID-19 is the typical issue. If I take care of my people, but my neighbor doesn't, but my neighbor states doesn't, then with trade and with other things, I will also be exposed. So we all need to work in this together. If the pandemic is spreading everywhere else, where my food, where my manufacturing products are coming from, where my customers are, I'm gonna suffering. So again, this made us realizing why it's so important to have this vaccine for COVID-19 as a global public good. And I think the same discourse applies to some extent to climate change. And of course, different people will be affected, but it's in the global interest. So can we develop a new narrative that includes these concepts of global public good, global interest, uniting us in these struggles against some of the challenges that are ahead.
I think, yeah, we managed to gather all the questions there. If anyone, we are now close to the time, but if anyone would like to raise a final point, please feel free to.
Hello, sorry, my computer just collapsed. I just wanted to thank you all very much and remind you, unfortunately, I don't have the slides because my computer collapsed, but I just wanted to remind you that the next event is going to be on the 2nd of June, and is going to be around the pedagogies of social learning, and will be hosted by Adriana Hallen and Julia Wesley. So we look forward and do check our website for blog posts from this series, from other videos of other events, and also from to check for future events. And I'm sorry if your question has not been answered. Do drop me an email and I'll do my best to try to answer and address it. Thank you very, very much. And hopefully see you all on the 2nd of June.